Right now, somewhere within a few miles of you, a person you have never met is touching your dinner. They put it in a bag, sealed it with a sticker, and handed it to a second stranger on a scooter who is currently doing 40 in a 30 zone with your noodles in a backpack. You will eat that food without a second thought, which is odd when you consider that for most of human history, the more powerful you became, the more likely it was that lunch was trying to kill you. So how did the emperors of China survive dinner? Not metaphorically, literally. Every day, several times a day for 2,000 years, the most powerful man in East Asia had to solve a problem that no amount of power could solve for him, which is that he had to open his mouth and put something inside it that somebody else had made. Now, the popular answer to this is silver chopsticks. Everyone knows this one. The emperor's silverware turned black in the presence of poison, and the plot was foiled. Roll credits. The second popular answer is the food taster, a nameless unfortunate who ate a spoonful of everything and occasionally dropped dead mid-course, which is treated in most retellings as a mild scheduling inconvenience. And the third answer, offered mainly by people who have never met a family, is that the emperor was surrounded by loyal relatives who would never dream of harming him. Right. The loyal relatives. The ones who inherit everything the moment he stops breathing. None of these are wrong, exactly. They're just the visible tip of one of the most elaborate food security bureaucracies ever built by human beings. And the actual answer is far stranger, far more paperwork intensive, and involves a man I am going to call Gary. Because before we get to palaces, we have to deal with a much older problem, which is that humans are the only animal on Earth that routinely eats food prepared out of sight by somebody else. Think about how weird that is. A wolf watches its dinner stop moving. A deer inspects the leaf personally. Almost every animal on the planet has an unbroken chain of custody between thing in the world and thing in my mouth. Humans broke that chain roughly the moment we started cooking, which is somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we have never repaired it since. Fire made food safer and more digestible, and it also introduced the world's first opportunity to add something to a pot when nobody was looking. Then there's the chemistry. Plants, being unable to run away, spent several 100 million years developing an extremely aggressive customer retention strategy involving alkaloids, glycosides, and various compounds that shut down your nervous system. Humans, being curious and hungry, cataloged all of them. We learned which roots cure a fever and which roots end a bloodline, and here is the uncomfortable part. Those are frequently the same root at different doses. Ancient Chinese pharmacology was genuinely sophisticated, which is another way of saying that the imperial court employed a large number of people who were professionally excellent at poisoning. And on top of the biology sits the politics. Hereditary autocracy has a design flaw so obvious it's almost funny. The people closest to the throne are the people who benefit most from it being empty. The emperor did not dine among neutral parties. He dined among stakeholders. For most of human existence, none of this mattered because there was nowhere to hide. In a small mobile band or a village of a few dozen, food was cooked in the open by people whose names you knew and whose mothers you also knew. Everyone ate from a shared pot. That shared pot is not just a cooking method, it's a security protocol, the most elegant poison detection system ever devised, because the cook eats it too. Add reputation to that, and gossip, which in a face-to-face community is essentially a distributed criminal database with no delete function, and you have a society where poisoning someone is theoretically possible and practically suicidal. Everyone would know. Everyone would know immediately, and your family would still be living next door to the victim's family in 40 years. This worked beautifully. It worked right up until humans figured out how to store grain. Then we built cities. Agriculture didn't create poisoning. It created something far more dangerous, a kitchen you couldn't see into. Surplus meant specialists. Specialist meant a professional cooking staff, and a professional cooking staff meant that for the first time in human history, the person who prepared your meal might be someone you had never met, working in a building you had never entered, under a supervisor who reported to a supervisor. The shared pot was gone. Reputation didn't scale. Gossip couldn't cover a palace complex with 1,000 employees. So the Chinese state did what states do when trust fails. It replaced trust with procedure, and the procedure is documented in detail, going back astonishingly far. The Rights of Zhou, a text describing an idealized version of Zhou-era administration and probably compiled around the 3rd century BCE, lays out the royal household as a staffing chart. And the striking thing about that chart is how much of it is food. Depending on how you count, well over half of the listed royal household personnel were involved in obtaining, preparing, serving, or supervising the king's food and drink. There is an office of the Shanfu, the food steward, whose duties include tasting what the king is about to eat. There are butchers, and internal cooks, and external cooks, and people whose entire job is the ice. This is not a kitchen. This is a government ministry that happens to produce soup. The Book of Rights goes further and makes the tasting explicitly moral. When the ruler is ill and takes medicine, the minister tastes it first. Not as a precaution, as a duty, as correct behavior. Remember that, because it matters later. By the Tang dynasty, it's written into criminal law. The Tang Code, promulgated in the mid-7th century CE, contains articles dealing specifically with the preparation of imperial food, and the penalties are not subtle. Violate the dietary prohibitions while preparing the emperor's meal, and the chief cook is strangled. Let something filthy end up in the food, 2 years of penal servitude. Fail to select the ingredients properly, or serve at the wrong time, reduced penalties. And, my favorite, if you fail to taste the food before it goes out, 100 blows with the heavy stick. 100 blows for not tasting. This is the world's oldest known mandatory quality assurance policy, and the enforcement mechanism is a stick. By the Qing dynasty, this had matured into something a modern food safety auditor would recognize immediately and find deeply excessive. The imperial kitchen employed enormous staff. Dishes traveled from kitchen to emperor in covered, sealed containers under escort. Each dish carried a small silver tablet, the test plaque, which a eunuch would inspect. A eunuch then tasted the food in the emperor's presence. And every dish, every day, was written down in the imperial menu archives, along with the name of the person who cooked it. That last part is the real innovation, and it has nothing to do with silver. Because the silver, scientifically, is mostly theater. Silver tarnishes in the presence of sulfur compounds. Pure arsenic trioxide, the classic court poison, the white powder, doesn't tarnish silver at all. Crude, badly refined arsenic often contains sulfur impurities, so the trick sometimes worked, in the way that a broken clock sometimes works. Meanwhile, egg yolk contains sulfur, which means the imperial poison detection system was capable of confidently identifying a hard-boiled egg as an assassination attempt. No, the actual defense was the ledger. Every dish had a name attached to it, which means if the emperor died on a Tuesday, the state knew exactly who had touched the fish. Which brings us to Gary. Gary is an undercook in the imperial kitchen. Gary is not a poisoner. Gary is worse. Gary is careless. Gary is the man who tastes the soup by dipping his finger in it while nobody is looking, who is slightly hungover on the morning of the autumn banquet, and who once tried to reuse a sauce. Under the shared pot system, Gary is a guy the village mocks. Under the Qing system, Gary is a name in a permanent government record, and if anything goes wrong with that dish at any point in the next 12 hours, that record is going to be read aloud in a room Gary very much does not want to be in. The genius of the imperial food system was not detecting poison. It was making every single person in the chain personally, individually, and permanently accountable for it. It's version control with capital punishment. There were behavioral defenses too, and the most famous is the rule, reported in Qing palace accounts, that the emperor should never take more than 3 bites of any single dish. The logic is beautiful. If nobody knows what you love, nobody knows what to poison. Your preferences are a vulnerability. So the most powerful man in the empire ate dozens of dishes and finished none of them, which is either the height of imperial security doctrine or the world's saddest tasting menu. Puyi, the last emperor, wrote later that the food from the imperial kitchen was largely ceremonial. prepared far in advance, kept warm for hours, technically edible in the way that airport sushi is technically sushi. The banquet was a display of order. The actual eating happened elsewhere. Now, this is where the story gets messy. Because we have to ask an awkward question: how often did any of this actually happen? How many emperors were really poisoned? The answer is that we have almost no idea, and the reason is that nearly everything we know comes from official histories written after the fact, usually by the regime that replaced the one being described. The previous emperor was poisoned by his scheming relative, is a claim that does an enormous amount of political work for whoever is writing it down. Take the death of Emperor Ping of Han in the early 1st century CE, traditionally attributed to poisoned wine administered by the regent Wang Mang, who then took the throne. Convenient story. Possibly true. Also exactly what you would write if you wanted to delegitimize Wang Mang, which the later Han historians very much did. So was court poisoning a constant reality that the system was built to stop? Was it a rare event that generated wildly disproportionate paranoia, the way a single dramatic plane crash reshapes an entire industry? Or was it primarily a rhetorical weapon, an accusation so useful that it got applied to any death that was politically inconvenient? Archaeology, annoyingly, did not leave us a sticky note explaining which deaths were murder. Except once. In 2008, forensic testing of hair, bone, and clothing samples attributed to the Guangxu emperor, who died in 1908, one day before the Empress Dowager Cixi, found arsenic concentrations thousands of times above normal. That one is not a rumor. That one is chemistry. And here's the twist that undercuts the entire apparatus. The most reliable way for a Chinese emperor to die of poison was not assassination. It was his own wellness routine. Multiple emperors across multiple dynasties consumed alchemical elixirs of immortality containing cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide, and various arsenic compounds prescribed by court alchemists as longevity treatments. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, reportedly died in 210 BCE while pursuing exactly this. Several Ming emperors show the same pattern. Yongzheng's sudden death in 1735 has long been suspected to involve elixir poisoning. Thousands of staff, sealed containers, silver plaques, professional tasters, criminal statutes with strangulation attached. And the poison walked in through the front door with a prescription. The call was coming from inside the palace. The honest answer is probably some combination of all of these, varying enormously by dynasty and by decade: genuine plots, inflated accusations, chronic heavy metal self-medication, and ordinary infectious disease that nobody in the 12th century could diagnose, and everybody in the 12th century found suspicious. But the system outlived the question entirely because it stopped being about poison. Watch the sequence. A precaution became a procedure. The procedure became a job. The job became an office with a budget. The office became law, and then the law became something more powerful than law. It became virtue. Tasting the ruler's medicine was written into the ritual texts as filial and loyal conduct. Emperor Wen of Han is celebrated among the classic exemplars of filial piety, partly for personally tasting his mother's medicine before she took it, for years. That story is not told as security policy. It's told as love. That's the sacralization step, and it's the most impressive part of the whole thing. The Chinese state took an act of pure paranoia and rebranded it as devotion. Suddenly, the man tasting your soup wasn't a disposable early warning system. He was performing correct cosmic order. The emperor was the son of heaven. His meals were rites. The kitchen was an extension of the ancestral temple. And the whole terrifying machinery of suspicion got dressed up in ceremonial robes and called propriety. Excellent branding, honestly. And Gary? Gary retired. Gary spent 30 years in that kitchen, never poisoned anybody, was flogged twice for procedural violations, and is now the only member of his family whose name appears in a state archive. Immortality, of a sort. Which brings us back to that scooter, because you have all of it. You just don't notice. The tamper evidence sticker on the bag is a silver plaque. The lot number on the yogurt is the Imperial Menu Archive. The allergen labeling, the food handler certification, the health inspection grade in the window, the little card that says your salad was packed by employee number 47. That is the Tang code, minus the stick. You are protected by a system of documentation, licensing, and traceable individual accountability so vast and so boring that you have stopped being able to see it, and it is doing every single day, for you, exactly what 1,000 people in silk robes once did for one man who wasn't allowed to admit which dish he liked. The emperor could not trust his own brother. You trust a stranger on a scooter. Convenience is just paranoia that finally got organized.